Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Kara Masick, who is an Air Force 14F Information Operations Officer with a passion for MISO PSYOP. She is currently a PhD student at George Mason University, where she is studying psychology within the Measurement Research Methodology Evaluation and Statistics Lab. Kara Masick, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me, John. I love this podcast.
Also to our audience, before we get into this, just want to let everyone know that Kara's opinions are her own and do not represent the opinions or official policy of the Air Force or any other U.S. government agency. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Kara, will cover a recent article that you published via the Information Professionals Association blog entitled 12 Missteps from Sober Assessments, Confessions of a Failed OIE Assessor. What an intriguing title. And by the way, to our audience, a link to this article will be in the show notes for you to go check out if you would like a deeper dive into all of this. So looking forward to chatting about that with you, Kara. But before we get into these fascinating topics, could we please start by getting your overall assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you like, the times in which we live?
Okay. I'll go with the strategic landscape, although I'm not the best person to answer that question for sure. I'll give it a shot. And I want to go real strategic for shaping the information environment. So I've actually been reading about ancient rhetoric lately for my dissertation research on persuasion, and I'm loving it, like nerding out. And there's a couple things that I've read that will help me articulate some things I've been thinking and feeling about our sort of work for quite some times. The first are the fact that ancient writings about rhetoric make a lot of analogies between rhetoric and medicine. Medicine towards healing the body and rhetoric towards healing the soul. So with shaping the strategic information environment landscape, strategic communications, the big thing I've been thinking for years is like, can't we have a good positive messaging effort that's good for humans globally, for America and Americans and others, that inspires us all to what's good, true, or beautiful, or at least dialogue and discussion in pursuit of those things, a cornerstone of democracy since ancient times. And regardless of what our strategic competitors do, we can make a better us in the information environment, in information operations, cognitive security realm. So I'm being a proponent of a better offense along with our defense, but emphasizing an improvement in our offense. The second thing that I read recently that just resonated with me, having done this type of work, is that it was said that the Greeks from Athens had two great goddesses, Peitho and Ananke, speech to persuade them to act in their own best interests, and the use of force to constrain them if necessary. So for global strategic influence, I see options of strategic communications or strategic attack, an Air Force doctrine term. And the Air Force is phenomenal at strategic attack. But we can also utilize rhetoric and persuasion, what international relations calls soft power, more effectively in today's strategic landscape. It can be done in an unprovoked, non-reactionary. It can be a consistent force. It can be consistent when actual use of force, like violent force, is only used if necessary. And I think there's room for improvement in strategic communications related realms, positive offensive operations in the information environment with positive offensive objectives, not just don't do this, don't do that. But big picture, what I'm trying to say is I think information professionals and actually anyone who communicates and does this type of work has the potential to inspire, convict, and even heal souls. So I believe that we can do our work towards healing, encouraging virtues, and even being an advocate for our country and our people. And this is important work that us information professionals do. And there's a very healthy, noble way of being in this profession that stood the test of time and will always apply no matter what our strategic landscape changes into, whatever things we encounter.
Wow, that is a I'm
Probably came
biased.
out of
No,
nowhere.
no, no, no. That
But
is really good. And I guess with my own biases, I guess I am partial to that kind of a I don't know, sentiment, I guess, or
oh, nice.
outlook. Yeah, bringing in um, you know mythology and symbology, and somehow using that as part of the megaphone. Or I uh, I really like the symbology. I think it was used by Ronald Reagan, or certainly back in that time period, but like the shining city on the hill kind of a thing, where America is signaling to the world, some sort of um, idealistic state, which doesn't exist, but it's
Yeah.
aspirational at least. But what what I heard you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but somehow weaving that into our global strategic communications is those kinds of sentiments and symbols. Would you say that that at
Certainly.
least is directionally accurate with the kind of thing you were saying?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely an emphasis on um a like a messaging about truth, goodness, and beauty,
Mm,
whether it's particularly so yeah, whether it's particularly American or not, just like as someone
mhm.
who works for the American government, I think we can be a part of messaging these things. And yeah, just reading about the goddesses and just the ancients and
Mhm.
how this communication and rhetoric and dialogue towards these good things um, is just human. And yeah, the archetypes
Right.
of these things just and it just helped me kind of like verbalize things I've been thinking about our work. Because I've heard and you've discussed with other people about, our policy to strategic communications. Sometimes it can be, don't do this, don't do that, the wagging of the finger of things that
Mm,
Americans can get behind. It's more defensive, reactionary at times than I think it doesn't have to be. And there's just like a human precedence for
mm.
being able to be a proponent of, yes, American values, but that can also be just values that are good
Yeah.
for Americans and people everywhere in the globe,
You're
I
right,
guess.
right, right,
Um,
right,
j-
right, right. American values are have a universal appeal, and so removing the word American can be helpful in that there, lots of global peoples appreciate freedom. It's not just an American thing, it's so, messaging about freedom doesn't have to be preceded by the word American. Just messaging about freedom can be beneficial just by itself.
yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah, and
uh,
oh,
yeah,
sorry.
no, go
Yeah,
ahead.
being a proponent of the offensive messaging, but also I think there's like a the role for authentic dialogue as well, and a give and a take.
Mm.
Yeah, reading from the ancient rhetoric, like writings about ancient rhetoric, but also reading some of the ancients like Plato talking about rhetoric. And yeah, they're talking about how dialogue and real hardcore study about rhetoric happened with democracy. So
Mm.
yeah, I
Mm.
think it could be a hallmark of something that we could be good at, that we can
Yeah.
capitalize on and share,
Yeah.
and kind of lean into and not be embarrassed of. Maybe that's might not
Right.
be the right
Right.
word, but
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um
Well, yes. To our audience, two episodes came to mind as Kara was sharing all that. As one, an episode that we did with a Jungian analyst named Joseph Lee. It's really actually one of the more popular episodes according to download count. So Joseph Lee on Jung and archetypes, and also a nifty episode that we did more recently, maybe about a year ago, with a researcher at the Smithsonian, Teasel Muir Harmony, and she is a researcher on the Apollo project, the from the 19 well, she goes all the way back into the 1950s and space flight, but all the way through the Apollo missions and the soft power influence from the space race from that time period. Really, really interesting discussions. I think that are in the same zip code as what Kara was just discussing. All right, so Kara, I just read a very short bio. Do you think maybe you could give just a little bit more background on your career before we get into your article?
yeah, and I'd like to tell even a bit more background, a quick story, if it's okay, of what
Yes.
started my career, to kind of start talking about my background. So it's what motivated me to be an information professional. So my sophomore year at the Air Force Academy, a guest speaker, Chuck DeCaro, came to speak to my Arabic class, and he showed us propaganda videos. Um, and it was very apparent, like when you watched these, that there were like violent kinetic things happening, but it was being done for a psychological cognitive effect, like a tracer round. So like shooting a bullet like with a tracer round, when it would give away your location, it was more for it'd be tactically not advantageous, but more for the video. And he planted a seed, like a message of his own influence operation on me, that grew slowly. And over a year, and totally changed like what I wanted to do and thought I would want to do. Um, and he got me in touch with someone, a military strategic studies department teacher who was teaching like 5 senior cadets signed up for this elective on information warfare. And with my non-existent, free time, I would audit that class. But so then after about a year, like right before it was time to change your major, it was like the last like day or the day before the last day I went back to this military strategic studies professor who taught this information warfare class and said, hey, can you do this work in the military? How do you do that? How do you go about that? And
Mm.
he didn't know. He said, well, go talk to the poli-sci department. Walked up there, and thank goodness someone actually said, oh, check next door. I think I heard like some
Mm.
of them do stuff like that, and it was the behavioral science department. um, and I guess back in the day, one Air Force colonel got it to where the behavioral scientist, AFSC, 61 Bravo Air Force people could go to the PSYOP course at Fort Bragg and get a special designator on the back of their Air Force specialty code, to say that they can do this work, often deploying with the Army, or working to coordinate to drop leaflets and stuff like that. And yeah, that last day and all my life up to that point, I was preparing to go pre-med.
Mm.
I had even like shadowed all these doctors at Landstuhl Medical Center in Germany. Gave all of that up. The last day, it's like, okay, you have to do this major. You have to have a behavioral science degree in the Air Force at least if you want to try to do this. And yeah, like flipped then. And it was really a long shot. It was actually a less likelihood of getting into medical school. I think my dad thought I was crazy for that and other reasons at the time. But yeah,
shout out, Dad.
totally.
Yeah.
And because there were some years that the Air Force didn't need any behavioral scientists. So it was a huge long shot of like, okay, I'm going to try to do this. There might not even be the chance to ever do it. But luckily, years later, it's all worked out better than I imagined. Got to become a behavioral scientist and even got to go. At one point, I was trying, like, should I cross commission to the Army to do PsyOps? But I even got to go through the Air Force to the psychological operations qualifying course at Fort Bragg as a lieutenant. And Army people cross commission like as a, or they qualify as a captain and cross train into PsyOps. So got to do it even sooner. And now, actually, years ago, the Air Force changed behavioral scientists. They were operationalizing us into information operations officers, which is perfect and exactly what I wanted to do. People who didn't want to do that, they let cross train into other career fields, but they're like, we're taking no more behavioral scientists. You're all information operations officers. We even have our own qualifying course now.
This is what time period that you were just describing, Kara?
Yeah, that was 2016. Information became the seventh joint function, and they made our career field. Actually, if you're interested, I could get you in touch with someone way better to talk about all of that as well, and just information operations through the 14 Foxes and the Air Force. I think it's pretty cool stuff. But yeah, we get trained in military deception, operations security, and military information support operations, the joint term for psychological operations, and convergence of information warfare or information operations. And we're 14 Foxes, information operations officers. And I have a particular passion for an operational the MISO PSYOP, and believe assessments is like both a huge way we can improve our operations. I've also worked at the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, and been the first officially assigned 14 Fox at the Air Force's relatively new information warfare numbered Air Force, 16th Air Force. Formed through like the merging or converging of an impressive cyber NAF and ISR NAF numbered Air Force. And thank goodness I was working with a wider team of operations and information environment experts. So I was not alone by any means. It's just kind of fun to say that I was the first 14F billeted on the books. But so now I'm taking an operational pause, as you said, and getting a psychology degree, an amazing opportunity through my career field, sponsored by Special Operations Command. And I'll work MISO policy and assessments, work a job in assessments, what we're going to discuss the rest of this time. Next.
Yeah, well, excellent. Well, that's a perfect segue then into your article. And like I said at the top, we'll have a link in the show notes, but 12 missteps from sober assessments, Confessions of a Failed OIE Assessor. Curious title. Could you tell us about it and why you wrote the article?
Yeah, the title is a nod to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the first of the 12 steps being admitting that you have a problem. Because, and I did want the title to be a little self-deprecating because I am a little critical of other operations in the information environment assessors in the introduction. So I want to make it clear that, and be fair and acknowledge that I'm no better than they are. I mentioned like a Graphica and Stanford Internet Observatory report, and I'm critiquing, a bit of that, but just acknowledging that they probably did the best job anyone could with the data that they had. And a big point that I make is that we all fail at assessments. in the way that I describe it and explain that point that I make through the lens of the philosophy of science in the first and second confession I write up. And the article in a nutshell, speaking to my audience, I was picturing other, information professionals like those in this association, especially like ones like myself, operational in the military, trying to just get operations to happen, but you also have to do your own assessments, and just overall saying, assessments in operations in the information environment are difficult. You're not alone. Everyone fails at it. And here is why, according to philosophy of science literature. But most importantly, in the bulk of the paper, the next 10 subsections or confessions just cover things that are, I think, a healthy, productive perspectives to have for assessments and ways from program evaluation, the literature and the discipline, that we can improve assessments towards the betterment of future operations. And why I wrote it, just thinking of those colleagues. I've been in the spot where I'm about to brief a general on an assessment slide, and I'm thinking, man, I wish I knew the effect of our operations. I've been racking my brain instead of sleeping on long weekends to figure out how to present operational assessments for an upcoming IG inspection, or asked to provide assessments to higher headquarters for them to send the yearly review back to Congress. And so when given this PhD opportunity, I thought I should focus on assessments, but I didn't want to, because for me, sometimes it's been the most difficult aspect of my profession. But I thought maybe I'll just spin my wheels for 3 years, hitting my head against the wall, the same issues I've encountered. But lo and behold, through reading program evaluation literature while preparing for my comprehensive exams, I actually learned some things that I thought could be helpful to people in our community doing things that I was. And I also wanted to remember what I had read for my next job, so I wrote it down.
I'd like to circle back on a phrase you used just a moment ago, Kara. You said program evaluation. That seems like it's an important concept for our audience to understand better. And also, I know it's going to be coming up here very quickly, measures of effectiveness. Do you think you could take a moment and talk about those two concepts and distinguish them maybe a little bit?
Yeah, program evaluation is the use of social science research methods to evaluate the effectiveness of social programs. It's a whole academic field and applied industry worth of literature and experience towards working to improve assessments related work, specifically for social programs, these very human things that information professionals deal with. And it recognizes the social science behind our work with high standards for that, and also recognizes the more political and social aspects of our work, things that inform decision making that aren't purely data driven as well, more like political things rather than the purely the assessment results. And reading that literature, it was honestly like therapeutic, I'd say. And I learned a lot I wanted to share with our community. And then, so measures of effectiveness, like a big thing for us. I actually have a colleague who called it documenting evidence of Loch Ness, MO. That's what we call it, MO, MOE, measures of effectiveness. And I love that phrase because it gets at the challenges with this. And there's not even like particularly a set definition. It's a DoD term. Program evaluation talks about measuring outcomes and assessing impact. But I think of it more as you could think of it as the dependent variable in a social science experiment or something, and the measures of performance being the independent variable if you wanted to put it in an equation. Not that we're doing, experiments, but just if you wanted to calculate it in an regression equation, sorry. The Y could be your MO and the X could be your MOP or your measures of effectiveness being the result of a change in your measures of performance. Yeah, so while measuring the effectiveness of our work can be very challenging and you often you can't ever extremely prove the effectiveness. Doing our best effort to decrease uncertainty inherent in this work, even in a small way for our decision makers, can make this assessments work, and improving it just a little better make huge impacts. And it can also, doing it well, can help us identify where to improve our operations.
I see. Do you think maybe you could go into some of the typical ways that influence is measured and what some of the pros and cons are for those different techniques?
Yeah, and it totally depends on your context. So I know I'm going to miss some things. Like academics have this thing called an H index, which is calculated by their number of publications and citations for those publications. And marketing, brand awareness, click-through rates, buying the product. One trend I've seen in our work, and I think it's a pro, that you're capturing more data than just specifically the behavior change that you're looking for, is also to track iterations of influence on the way, if you will, towards that behavior change. I'd say more cognitive factors. In my persuasion literature, there's McGuire's output variables, things like liking the message, understanding it, agreeing, attitude change, remembering it, deciding to act, intending to do an action. Psychologists do that. Behavioral intent, often used in their research, often self-reported, and then actual action or desired behavior. And you can get more data, a pro, as you go more into the cognitive realm at times. But a con of that sliding scale, I guess, when you go towards assessment and cognitive factors, is maybe a lack of importance to the immediate real world operations. But you can assess more that impact you're having with the fidelity of data. But overall, a pro to track more data. And because persuasion has low effect size in the psychology research, so tracking people's sentiment towards ISIS in a region is also valuable outcome data, in addition to tracking, which ISIS members actually left the battlefield and went home, for example. And there's tons of factors with measuring influence. And tons of ways that you can do it. I talk about limitations, pros and cons of using engagement data in social media in my article. But there's also social network approaches to measure influence online from a lot of different angles. And I like the work from some of the sources I mentioned also in the article: Venhouse et al., Matt Venhouse, Smith et al., Smith et al. And the stuff done by Rand and Chris Paul. Particularly, I like Bayesian statistics and its applicability to real world decision makers. And just getting a thanks to my advisor, Patrick McKnight, for teaching me the Bayesian and all this program evaluation stuff in general. Rand's taxonomy of influence strategies gives a categorization of specific plays. I know you had an episode on that, and you could capture those things, break down an influence campaign into its little parts, assign weights, count it up. And I guess the last kind of influence distinction and pros and cons that I'll mention, although I just want to say everything studying persuasion myself, but that actually reminds me of a classic measurement or research methods distinction: the quantitative qualitative data for measuring influence. And often we would use like a story when talking to a general about assessments, and sometimes you can wonder if that kind of qualitative data lacks a scientific rigor. But through reading this program evaluation stuff, like I would say more, no, this can be extremely important. Include that qualitative stuff with the quantitative. Focus on trying to decrease the uncertainty for your decision maker. And if these stories are the best way to communicate a truth that's happening in the operational environment to your decision maker, or the story is the most effective mode of communicating with a particular decision maker about influence in an operation, go for it. There are cons and pros with everything that you do.
Mm.
And mixed methods is always the best, quantitative and qualitative. And this may be a tangent here, but just
Mm-hmm.
saying that the large language models also seem to be bridging that gap and distinction between quantifying all of this qualitative data and generating qualitative data back based on quantitative calculations of it.
Mm.
So yeah, with a lot of the pros and cons, and every single measurement that you will take will have some error. There's no perfect measurement. So yeah, mixed methods, and just including those pros and cons in your calculus as you're combining all of this for a better operational picture.
All right. Well, I guess all of this I would put into the category of hard, difficult to do. But is there any like spectrum of challenge uh, where some things are either maybe intuitively easier for people to understand, or are easier for people to hit the yes button? I believe that this is in fact the case compared to something else. And let me just like, so two examples come to mind. So a you know being able to assess whether or not somebody or a group of people actually changed their opinion or changed their I don't know, values based upon an influence campaign, compared, say, to something that would be like considered like very short term, like I mean, this is a silly example, but it's raining outside and I see people now have umbrellas, right? I mean, that's also a form of influence. It's more of like a natural influence. But do you get what I'm saying? There's like a
Yeah.
spectrum of I don't know, subtleness or something like that, where, if it's raining and people put on, rain gear, that's uh, it's a lot easier to say, okay, well, I think that the rain is causing that, and maybe it can be measured and much more easily in a social science context. Say, yes, in fact, there is a causal relationship there, but a group of people changing their value structure based upon an influence campaign, that seems like it's harder to do. So, I mean, there's a question in there somewhere. Do you kind of get what I'm asking?
Yeah. Certainly. And yeah, some of of even like does yeah, choosing kind of who to talk to, what to share, what to say, yeah, can be informed by those factors and assessments of, the information environment, what's the objective, what's even possible. Yeah, definitely persuasion and persuasion research, been reading through it, has, smaller effect sizes. Program evaluation recognizes that often um, the measured assessment of social programs impact on average is null. It's called Rossi's iron law. Um, yeah, so recognizing and having like a respect for um, the gravity of what you're going to try to do, and also effectively communicating to decision makers what is even possible. But my advisor's advisor actually had the best comment in this. It was in a program evaluation annual review many years back, and he said, just because there's a small effect size does not mean it's unimportant.
Mm,
That can have the most grave impact, even in voting, for example. A small change in who's going to vote one way to another way can have huge impacts.
mm,
um,
mm,
so yeah, just all of that uncertainty and yeah, the varying difficulty, just better quantifying, measuring, capturing that for your decision maker through assessments and presenting them a more realistic, truthful gauge of the information environment, what can and can't be changed, and how you're going to attempt to change certain things, what the best things are to message about that's possible,
mm, mm.
is what your question kind of made me think of,
Right,
all these considerations. But yeah.
right. And then also like short-term compared to long-term influence effects. So if the
Oh, yeah.
if the Sixth Fleet or the Fifth Fleet, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, parks a a Marine expeditionary unit off the coast of Africa somewhere, just the presence of those ships and the military presence has an effect. The effect may be relatively short term, but those kinds of effects could be measured presumably in the change in patterns of life or activities of the inhabitants on the coast, or the governments, and some ways that we have of observing that. But again, that is different still from some kind of a campaign that's designed to change people's long-term or long-held belief structures.
Yeah, like you said, that made me think of like your work with systems and the importance of like the whole system. And also people talk about, the longitudinal data, getting a baseline and tracking long-term patterns over time. Certainly. And yeah, certain types of campaigns and even social science experiments deal with something like immediately in the moment versus long-term change or something that sticks. Yeah, that is a significant difference to note that you brought up, for sure.
In your paper, you introduce a new term. I assume that you're socializing this, but MLC, or most likely cause. Could you explain this new term and why you think it might be helpful for information professionals to consider this as a way of looking at the problem?
Yeah, one of the most difficult things, like with assessing our effectiveness in social science and with our work, are these confounding variables, and the trouble that you can get into with that in the information environment. So with this most likely cause, it can be a helpful way of viewing assessments to search for, perhaps in addition to measures of effectiveness. You can look for evidence supporting a case that our operations were or were not the most likely cause of the data or intelligence that we collected. I'm just thinking it could be like a good way for our operators and assessors to think, to adopt more of like a detective's perspective or an IT help desk troubleshooter's role while trying to determine, when they try to determine what a detective, the most likely cause of a death, or an IT help desk person, the most likely cause of your computer issue. So when you see an effect, more or less, of an audience doing the behavior that we want, or we're encouraging, for example, we can try to determine if our operations were that most likely cause of that effect.
It's
So
kind of like developing a way of listing out a number of possibilities that may be true, and if you can subjectively tick off a number of those, then you can start making the case, at least, that it appears the preponderance of evidence suggests. I mean, these are all kind of squishy terms, but as you can align with some of these line items, you can start making a more convincing case that I do believe that what we did here had an effect, and something along those lines.
Totally, exactly. Like other potential causes, then our operations can be, other influencers, seasonal factors, a historic event that just occurred. And you could realistically weighing out the relatively likelihoods or the significance of our operations causing a notable effect or a small change with the preponderance of other factors in the system. But yeah, I learned about this through the source that's in the footnotes of my article, Michael Scriven's modus operandi method of evaluation, if anyone wants to go deeper into that.
I'll pull that one out specifically and put a link to that in the show notes.
Cool, thank you.
Well, My goodness, Kara, this is obviously a very live topic, and it is, maybe there's more questions than answers still, but that's why people like you are investigating it and helping the U.S. and our friends and allies and free societies orient on this problem and understand how we're being influenced and ways of managing the problem. Way back to the very beginning of this podcast, the very first episode that we had was with a gentleman named Dr. Rand Waltzman, and that was one of the things that I picked out from his writings and research is that um, the problem that we're in uh, can be thought of as a chronic condition, meaning there is no cure, but it may be managed. And what you were just talking about with your most likely cause model or methodology of thinking about this could be a really effective way of helping to manage the problem, right? And so, really, really stellar work, important work, and wish you the best as you continue with it.
Thank you.
Perhaps we can do a real quick lightning round and then close it out. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so we've been talking about this already, but if you could just like really nug it down, first lightning round, correlation versus causality.
Yeah, operations in the information environment assessments are often trying to infer a cause and effect relationship from MOP to MOE, but due to many factors, mostly confounding variables, mediating and moderating, a correlation between those two does not always mean that our operations cause the effect that we observed.
All right.
Sadly.
Yeah. In your article, you also this is supposed to be the lightning round, but you give a really nice vignette or a you reference back to John Stuart Mill, I believe, and his
Yeah.
concise definition of of the conditions the conditions that must be met in order to assume or in order to prove causality, which is pretty nifty. Second lightning round. 80-20 solution.
Yeah, I love this ethos that the Marine Corps brings to things. Nothing in social science, love and war is ever perfect. You have to move forward with what's possible. The 80% solution, I think that's huge in assessments and even our operations sometimes, and using assessments to iteratively improve things as we go forward. And the best we can do is assess with probabilities and likelihoods to get the most nuance that we can to inform our decision maker.
Yeah, right.
And
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah, yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. No,
And
no,
that
go.
does
Yeah.
remind me about another thing I've started to like to say is like focusing on improving our operations. Once you get that 80% solution, not necessarily proving them, which is more of like 100% solution mindset for our assessments. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Next lightning round. Point target versus area target.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the term target audience, but that's what it makes me think of with my work.
Okay.
But I think of the point target being messaging individuals, more psychology, and the area being messaging people groups, more sociology informed.
Okay. Yeah. Last lightning round. Campaigning.
Yeah, it makes me think of research I read for a developmental psych class that I've had to take for my core psychology. It talks about kids trying to persuade others of their way of thinking of things as soon as they develop a theory of mind. So that's as soon as this is like toddlers, as soon as they realize that others don't think the same way they do, they could start, campaigning to influence you. I get that a lot with my toddler. But I do think the best way of campaigning is campaigning against myself towards my own behavior change, because that's who I can change. But a government has the right to campaign for its objectives, and I work for Uncle Sam, serving the land and people that I love. And I personally appreciate messaging that inspires me, convicts me, getting back to what I talked about at the beginning, and encourages me to live in a more virtuous manner. And I think there is a very healthy good and noble way of being information professionals that we are, campaigning for things. And it's important, challenging work that we can continue doing together as in the Information Professionals Association, striving to do it better and better, helping each other.
Yeah, awesome. I guess last question, we've already got a number of links that we're going to put into the notes for this episode, but is there another book or online resource that you might suggest to an interested audience member to go check out if they want to learn more about these kinds of topics? Or it could just be, what's on your bedside table these days that is part of your professional military education.
Yeah, and this one actually can be in a tab in your computer. I've got a billion tabs up, but it's free online.
Yeah, what's an open tab on your computer right now? That's right. Yeah.
Totally. And yeah, so picking one for assessments, it's actually a program evaluation textbook. Kind of like Rand has a really great reference for summative evaluation. And this is like another reference for, a program evaluation academic textbook. And I can give you the link. It's Evaluation: A Systematic Approach by Rossi, Lipsy, and Freeman. But yeah, I'll send you the link to that, John. But a couple more, if you really want to go dig really deep into program evaluation. Foundations for Program Evaluation, Theories of Practice by Shadish, Cook, and Leviton. Those are two things my advisor gave me to read for program evaluation. And for, more consolidated, focused list of resources like the ones Matt Venhouse and Chris Paul. And I actually wrote my article like specifically for operators, consolidating resources that they may want if they have time to look more into assessments. Those resources they could look at are all my sources in there as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So again, heartily recommend information professionals and listeners of this podcast check out the article that Kara's been referencing here, and these other resources. And again, Kara, wish you all the best in your studies and your colleagues. Godspeed as you do great things on behalf of free societies. And with that, Kara Masick, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Oh, thank you for having me, John, and thank you for everything you do. I've learned so much through your podcast, and will continue to participate and learn. Thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.